29-year-old William Bousfield had dreams of becoming a successful actor. The only time he took centre stage was on the scaffold at Newgate Prison in London. Bousfield had trained as a clerk, but having married without informing his employer, he was dismissed. He went on to train as a French polisher, but work was difficult to come by, so his father-in-law, John Jones, fitted the couple up with a shop. It was his wife, 28-year-old Sarah Jones, who ran the newspaper and tobacco shop in Portland Street in the Soho district of London. Sarah appeared to have done a good job of running the business, but Bousfield became increasingly jealous, telling her she was becoming too familiar with the customers, even though the customers preferred her to serve them rather than her rather dour husband. The couple had 3 children. Bousfield's passion, however, was for the theatre. He gained employment on occasion as an extra in various theatres, but he was idle and neglected the business. Up until the previous Christmas, though, he worked as an extra at the Princess's Theatre in Oxford Street, but the wages were low. He then gained employment at Covent Garden Theatre, at a pantomime put on by the self-styled Professor John Henry Anderson, his wages increasing to 5 shillings a week, as he was no longer just an extra. He was described as being civil but quiet, temperate, and never smoked outside his own home, but he began not looking for work other than theatre work. The marriage was by now an unhappy one, and he and Sarah could often be heard arguing, especially after the birth of their 3rd child. She was heard to call him a worthless, idle fellow, although not in quite such a polite way. On the morning of Sunday 3rd February 1856, Bousfield entered the Bow Street police station, his hands covered in blood, and asked police officer Alfred Fudge to see the inspector on duty. Fudge asked what he was doing there, and he replied, "To give myself up. I have murdered my wife." He was introduced to Inspector William Dodd and calmly told him about the murder. There was nothing in his demeanour to make the inspector suspect he was mentally ill, so sat him down and took his statement. He said his name was William Bousfield and that he lived at 4 Portland Street, was a news vendor and tobacconist. He stated he'd stabbed his wife in the neck with a chisel that morning and thought he should present himself to the police. Dodd and Fudge made their way to Portland Street. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer for quite some time, so he used the latchkey that had been found on Bousfield when he'd been searched. At this point, a neighbour came down. When told of the murder, the neighbour explained that Bousfield occupied the shop and the parlours of the house with his family, and accordingly, they tried the back parlour door. It was locked, but he burst it open, and inside found not only the body of Sarah, but also the bodies of their 3 children. All had been dead for a few hours. Dodd returned to Bow Street and charged Bousfield with the wilful murders of his wife and his daughters Eleanor Ann, aged 6, Eliza Sarah, aged 4, and his son John William, aged 8 months. After the charges had been read out, Bousfield said, "I hope the children are not all dead," which is rather bizarre considering the charge. He was examined by Dr. Snitch, the medical officer of the police court, but found to be of sound mind, and he'd not been drinking. The bodies of the victims were moved to St James's Workhouse in Poland Street, where an inquest by the coroner of Westminster took place on Tuesday the 6th. Dr. James Hathaway, the surgeon who first saw the bodies, said the wounds were the cause of death in all victims. He didn't think any had struggled. The jury at the inquest returned the verdict of willful murder against Bousfield. That same day, John McLaughlin, one of the warders at the prison, searched Bousfield and found his shirt saturated with blood and the right sleeve gone. When asked where it was, he said he had no idea. The following day, Inspector Dodd went back to Portland Street and found the sleeve, also covered in blood, by the side of the bedstead. It appeared to have been torn from the shirt. On the morning of Monday the 11th, the streets leading to the Marlborough Street Police Court were crowded with people who wanted a glimpse of the murderer. Shortly before 1 o'clock, he appeared in the dock in the custody of Inspector Dodd. The charges were read out, and while they were, Bousfield had to be supported by Mr. Bendel, the deputy jailer, and police constable Silverton. At first he refused to give his name, and due to him struggling, eventually he had to be handcuffed. During the trial, Inspector Dodd told the court about his interview with Bousfield. He said that the first thing the prisoner said to him was, "I've killed my wife." So he asked where and got the details. When he gained entry, he found Sarah on the bedstead, lying on her back with a large cut on her neck and blood everywhere. In the same bed was 4-year-old Eliza, with her head towards the foot of the bed, but also with a wound to her throat. She too was covered in blood. He also discovered the chisel and a razor on the bed, both covered in blood. The chisel was later identified by Jones, who'd given it to Bousfield. He sent Fudge to get Dr. Hathaway at Berwick Street, and he came immediately. Further evidence was given, and Bousfield was committed for trial. On Thursday, 6 March 1856, Bousfield stood in the dock before Judge Sir William Whiteman at the Central Criminal Court, known as the Old Bailey in London, charged with the murders of his family. The prosecution was led by Mr. Bodkin and Mr. Clark. Bousfield had pleaded not guilty. His solicitor, William Ballantyne, addressed the jury, saying that at the time he'd committed the crime, he wasn't responsible for his actions. However, after a few minutes of deliberation, they returned the verdict of guilty, and Whiteman sentenced him to hang. On hearing this, Bousfield nearly sunk to the ground and had to be assisted by 2 turnkeys from the dock. On Monday, 31st March, he was publicly executed at Newgate Jail. But the execution didn't go smoothly. On the Saturday, his 2 sisters visited him to say their goodbyes, and he was later visited by the sheriffs, who confirmed his execution was going ahead, but he never spoke. At around 4 p.m, he was sitting on the end of his bedstead facing his fire, when he suddenly threw himself at it, his neckerchief catching fire. His face and neck were badly burned, but a jailer noticed it and quickly dealt with the situation. With the help of other guards, he was secured, and Dr. Gibson, the prison surgeon, was sent for. By the Monday, his face was swollen and hideous. At 7:30 that Monday morning, Mr. Alderman and Sheriff Kennedy, and Sheriff Rose, along with Under Sheriff Stone and J.A. Rose, arrived at the prison. 15 minutes later, they were joined by the Reverend Mr. Davis and went to Bousfield's cell. When they saw him, he was sitting in a chair in a state of weakness, being supported by 2 jailers. A few minutes before 8 o'clock, William Calcraft, the executioner, entered the cell and began pinioning his arms. To get him to the scaffold, Bousfield was carried to the foot of it, the prison bell tolling. There then rose the issue of getting him onto the scaffold, so a chair was brought out for him to sit on, and he was placed under the beam, ready for the drop. Calcraft, having placed the rope around Bousfield's neck, ran down the scaffold and withdrew the bolt of the trap. The chair dropped from under him, and he became suspended, but his ruse at being incapable disappeared as he raised his arms up and threw his legs in all directions to try and get a foot on the right edge of the scaffold for support, which he did. His left foot soon followed. A jailer pushed his legs down, while Calcraft ran from under the scaffold. The sheriffs and other officials tried to stop him, but he insisted the man was dead. Meanwhile, Bousfield managed to struggle and place his feet on the left side of the scaffold. The sheriffs, especially Mr. Alderman Rose, were so horrified they insisted Calcraft return and end the spectacle. Calcraft did return and pulled on the condemned man's legs, hanging on to them for a short time to make sure the job was done. It wasn't. For a third time, Bousfield succeeded in getting both feet to the edge of the scaffold. They were removed again, and after struggling for 10 minutes, the 4th time he was hanged was successful. The body was left until 9 a.m, when Calcraft cut it down, amongst the groans and hisses from the crowd. Bousfield was buried within the confines of the prison grounds.